And we're on.
All right, now I'll call the study session to order. We're going to be talking about the comp plan, predominantly around housing this evening, and be presented by our amazing planning staff, Sarah Brooks and Laura Weigel.
Great, thanks. Thank you very much, Mayor, councilors. I'm really excited that we have so much time to talk about this. We can really get into some of the details. You received a staff report that talked about some of the key issues that I wanted to bring up tonight. But of course, if there are other questions or other things that we should be thinking about, you know, as we move forward through this, just let me know. If it's okay, I'm going to share my screen, but we can kind of toggle back and forth, and please feel free to interrupt. No problem. I feel like all I'm doing is this project sometimes, so I'm perfectly happy to be interrupted, and let's go forward with this. So thank you. All right, let me share my screen. Okay. All right. Can everyone see the presentation? Yep. Great, thank you. Okay, I just wanted to start with the project schedule. You might note there's a slight change in the project schedule. The big red arrow has different text in it now. I'm not going to get into a ton of detail about the schedule tonight. We're coming back to you on June 15th with a much more detailed code adoption process schedule. But where we are right now is in the draft code maps and sort of reconciliation process right now. In the timeline, we will have draft code and maps by middle-ish of June. So we will be able to meet the deadline for the DLCD grant to have draft code that is compliant with House Bill 2001, but we see that as a milestone in this project and not the end of the project. There's still a lot of process that needs to happen beyond that. So we are, and by process, I mean work sessions, I mean much more work to go through the code, because the House Bill 2001 is not the only aspect of this code that we are doing. So we are assuming an adoption schedule that takes us into late fall, into probably December, but before we'll have the actual adopted code. But we will, as I said, get back to you. We will be back in a work session on June 15th to sort of lay out that process and that schedule, and we can talk about it in more detail at that point. But we've been sort of working through this schedule over the last several days, and this is sort of where we've landed as a reasonable schedule to make sure that we get all the details as correct and as right as we possibly can, but also make sure that there's plenty of time for community engagement on the actual code language itself. So that's sort of where we are on the schedule for now. And then I also just wanted to, before I get into the presentation, just to let you know that in this sort of cycle of issues to be discussing, the way the calendar laid out, you're the first group to be looking at this. Because that's just kind of how the calendar landed. So we're here for this study session to talk about this. CPIC will be reviewing generally this same material next week on the 20th. And then we will be at Planning Commission on May 25th. So we're sort of, that's kind of the order for this month. It doesn't always happen. Sometimes CPIC sees things before you folks do. It just depends on how the calendar lands. So I just wanted you to know that for May, anyway, that's kind of where we are right now. Okay. So if I could, again, just a reminder on the comprehensive plan policy mandates for this project. The goals for this project, or the mandates for this project, are to increase the supply of middle housing and provide housing choice throughout the city. We're working to increase tree canopy and preserve existing trees throughout the city as we're doing that. And then also to manage parking, facilitate middle housing, and protect trees kind of all at the same time. So those are our policy mandates that are driving this project. We wanted to start a little bit at the beginning of this presentation to talk about a little bit the House Bill itself, House Bill 2001, and the model code There's been a little bit of reference to the model code as well in some conversations, and we just wanted to take a minute and talk about what the relationship is between those two things. So the House Bill, or Division 46, which are the rules that enable the House Bill 2001 legislation, sort of lay out the standards and the requirements of House Bill 2001. At the same time, DLCD, or Department of Land Conservation, they were charged with preparing a model code that would comply with House Bill 2001, and that communities could choose to just adopt in whole. They could just sort of drop it into their code or tweak it as needed, but it was kind of a standalone code that would implement House Bill 2001. And it also, so it provides some guidance in code language form on how to implement House Bill 2001. If a community does not update or adopt code that is compliant with House Bill 2001 by the deadline, which is next year, 2022, next summer, then the model code will apply directly to the city that does not revise its own code. So it just kind of happens to you at that point if you haven't done the process. So a community has choices. A community can adopt the model code as is, can adopt portions of the model code, can adopt a completely new code that still meets House Bill 2001 or the enabling the regulations, Division 46. So those are sort of the options. But so the model code is obviously House Bill 2001 compliant. It's been described to me as kind of the, it's sort of the, I guess I'll call it sort of the state of the art, or sort of the best case scenario, in that it has been written and is intended to provide the most opportunity to develop middle housing in a community. So you might note, or there has been, as I was looking through it a little bit to kind of compare, in some places, for example, the setbacks in the model code are 10 feet for front and rear yard. In our code, the setbacks are 20 feet. So that's just one example of some ways that, but the intent is to make it, to facilitate the development of middle housing within a community. So what we are choosing to do is to not adopt the model code. We are going to be developing code that obviously complies with House Bill 2001, but we are using the model code as guidance, as a guidance document. There are some places that we might pull some of their suggested, design standards or something to kind of add to our own code. So we're using it in parallel, but we're developing our own code that fits and meets our goals and sort of conforms to what we're hearing from the community for various designs and development standards and so on. So we're just using it as a way to sort of, as a check, to kind of see what kind of language DLCD came up with to implement the House bill itself. But so if there are things that folks might, well, the model code says XYZ, that may be true, but we're using Division 46 and the House bill enabling rules and regulations as our guide for the code. The House bill is not the requirement. It's a model code that implements House Bill 2001.
Vera,
So,
could you, just because of some comments we received in advance of the study session, could you just speak very briefly to the grant that we received from DLCD and why we did that grant and why they were interested in us doing the work a little in advance?
Sure.
Everyone's familiar with that.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. So DLCD has received state money to help communities implement House Bill 2001. And we are not the only community. I think there's more than a dozen communities that submitted grant application requests for basically technical assistance funds from DLCD to work on code amendments. And that announcement of the funding was last year. So last summer, or I guess basically this time last year, we were writing our grant applications for the funds. And so the way the grant cycle worked for DLCD, we were approved for $92,500 to help us with this project, with this process, to go through our tasks. The final task being that we would have draft code language that complies with House Bill 2001, and we need to submit all of that by June 18th. So that's the deadline that DLCD put together for their grant round. And I believe that deadline is tied to how they receive the money from the legislature. I don't know exactly, but that is a hard deadline. I might have asked about that to see if there was a little bit of wiggle room there, but that's that deadline. So when we talk about, or how I mentioned in the schedule, that being kind of a milestone, we see that as a milestone in this project, that we have draft code, and by that I do mean draft code, that will still get additional work done. Of course, we've added tree code into our project. So we have other things that we're working on within this project. Again, this is not a House Bill 2001 project, but it will be House Bill 2001 compliant. And we do have this additional financial assistance from the state to help us get there. But I guess I want to stress that the June 18th code that comes from that is not the final code, and it's certainly not the end of the project. There will be a lot more public process and discussion after that, and a lot more tweaks. And the state, you know, our staff person at DLCD knows that we've added a bunch of other things, you know, to our scope of work for the project. They're happy to see it. They're happy to see, you know, communities figure out how to do this. So that's great. So they so far seem really pleased with the work that we've been doing. But that's, as I said, it's a milestone in this project. It's not the end of the project.
So did the other dozen or however many cities that got grants, are they all kind of on the same schedule? The
Well, they
grant.
have to be. We all have the same deadline. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting because I've done some digging around trying to see where some cities are on their HB 2001, you know, work, and I'm not finding a ton. So yeah, okay.
Yeah.
That might explain it. Thank you.
Yeah, I know that Laura was in a meeting, I think earlier this week, with some other planning managers, planning directors from some other communities, and it sounds like a lot of communities are approaching this in very different ways, and they're in different places in the project. Laura, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but if you had anything to kind of shed some light on this.
I think all the different communities are approaching it different ways. Some communities are just doing absolute minimum compliance. Some communities are questioning whether they want to comply at all. So I think that there's a real mixed bag. There's some communities that are right on par where we are. So it's just it's different, I think, a little bit for every community. They all got different grant funds for slightly different processes.
Thanks. So, Councilor Heisey, did that answer your question, I guess, hopefully?
It did, yes, thank
okay,
you.
Great, good, okay. Okay, so if I can, let's talk about parking for a second. The presentation is a little, it's not following exactly the staff report. We're kind of sort of sticking to the House bill and sort of those requirements, and then going into some other topics a little bit after that. But as far as parking goes, we included this in our list of the, I guess we're sort of calling them slightly less complex amendments, the kinds of things that, you know, we need to do. We think they're a little more simple or hopefully straightforward to deal with. But as far as parking goes, so the House bill requires, we cannot require more than one parking space per dwelling unit. So our current code kind of, well, does that a little bit differently in a couple different ways. We require one space per dwelling unit for single unit homes. But then when it comes to multifamily development, we require 1.25 spaces if the dwelling is over 800 square feet. So we've got a couple of tweaks that we need to make within our own requirements for quantity. And as I think we've talked about before, when it comes to the location of that required parking space, our code requires that the required parking space is outside the front yard setback. So if you imagine a single unit home that's at the setback, so it's at the 20-foot setback, then they effectively need to have a garage or a side yard parking space or something like that, because the driveway parking space does not count towards the minimum required. So effectively, because of that standard, I'll call that as sort of a design standard or a development standard for the parking space, we're effectively requiring 2 parking spaces per unit. So what we are recommending, and again, the city can't require more than 1. And then there is a little bit of sort of wiggle room there. And I think that Councilor Falconer brought this up, that if we chose to permit middle housing on smaller lots than what the House bill says, then the required parking is reduced as well. And I think I included that in the staff report, all the different sort of how that gets reduced. We're not proposing that as part of our kind of package of recommendations to allow them on smaller lots, the triplex or the quadplex, and we'll get to that in a second. So we're working under this direction of 1 parking space per dwelling unit. What we are recommending is to make sure that we amend that table so that 1.25 and those things kind of come back down to the 1 for 1. But we are recommending that we allow the required parking space to be inside that front yard setback so that the driveway parking space would count as the required parking space. That allows for a bit more design flexibility on the site. It allows for the housing to take up more space. So we're not creating a garage if we don't need to. So certainly folks can. We're not suggesting any kind of a different maximum or anything like that, but it allows for a bit more design flexibility. And we've done some research, and sort of what we're understanding is that providing on-site parking can be expensive. You're taking up space from housing itself. So we'd like to be able to use that front setback or the driveway as the required parking space. It kind of does a little bit of extra work in that it's not just for the development for middle housing. It also allows for existing properties to be able to convert their existing garages into living space. That's been something that we've had trouble with in the planning department anyway. We often have questions from some of our older sort of mid-century homes, kind of the ranch, the 1-story ranch with the attached garage. Folks are pretty consistently asking to be able to convert the garage into living space. And if they don't have a side yard to be able to do the driveway and a parking space to the side, then they need to get a variance to that requirement, which is a type 3 variance with the Planning Commission. So it helps with the development of middle housing and does support that. But I would argue that it helps support our existing homes as well, and for folks to be able to expand and create a little more living space without having to build an addition or something like that. And a lot of those homes that we see these kinds of requests for are on, I guess I'll call them sort of constrained sites. They're on the smaller side of sites, so they don't have a lot of room to work as far as additions and that sort of thing. So it allows them to be able to expand their living space without having to expand the footprint of their property. And that makes it less expensive for folks to be able to do that too. So those are our recommendations as far as it related to these parking requirements and the House bill. Are there any questions about that?
So to me, the front yard setback one makes perfect sense. I mean, that is where people are parking, is in their driveways. The side yard, I guess I would want to see a little more definition of that, or what you mean, because if you're thinking about, I mean, we only have a required side yard of 5 feet, I think, in some places. So that's tough to get a car in there, and that's right up against somebody's property line and all of that. And I guess I would want to clarify that all of those options are paved, correct? They're not parking on your lawn.
Right.
I was happy to see that Rick Williams, when he did his parking assessment, did consider that illegal parking, but we have a lot of that going on.
Yeah. If I could respond, so it's actually the street side yard setback. It's not the side yard. So you can already park in your side yard. that's permitted. It's the street side yard setback, which, so corner lots is what that means. So so it allows for a bit more flexibility on that other corner, that other side. So it would be against a street. It wouldn't be within a butter next to you, but you can currently park in your side yard if you have enough width there. We've had some folks who have their home built in such a way that they have an extra large side yard. So when they want to convert their garage into living space, they've had the room to be able to kind of scoot their driveway and come up the side and, and do a parking space on the side, so that they can meet the letter of the code, and then be able to convert their garage. When we talk about pavement, so our code does require durable dust-free for the surface of the parking space. There are a lot of different ways to get there that are pavement, but it doesn't have to be blacktop. It can be concrete strips. We've had folks do the kind of the concrete pavers that grass grows in the middle of. I mean, so we try to be pretty flexible about that. Basically, it can't be gravel and it can't be grass because, we're trying to make sure that folks aren't dragging stuff out into the street. But over the years, or certainly since I've been here, we've had folks come up with some pretty creative ways to meet that and make sure that we're kind of covering it from a durable dust-free standpoint, but it doesn't have to be necessarily hot top. It can be other forms of pavement. And like I said, the concrete strips, like just the tire strips, like we try to, if folks want to minimize that, we work with them as much as we can to be able to do that. So that kind of idea of minimizing impervious surface on a site, we absolutely are sensitive to that. So to the extent that we can do that, or pervious pavement, there are a lot of different ways to get there. If that was your concern, Councilor Beatty, about kind of what is how much pavement we're putting on, but yeah.
Right. I mean, that's an interesting dance to do, right? Because we don't want, we like pervious, pavers or pervious options, but then we also have groundwater, we have cars leaking stuff into our groundwater, and so it's it's an interesting, the more I read about what the things that come out of our cars and even just off of our tires for fish, it's pretty astounding. There's some recent studies about tire rubber and salmon and stuff, but so it is an interesting balance about.
But if you think about it, if it's pervious, the ground is going to filter a fair amount of that before it gets to the groundwater, if not all of it. And if it's if it's impervious, it will absolutely end up in the rivers and the creeks, because the rain will wash it into the gutter and the gutter will wash it into the creek.
Well, except that our gutters, some of our rain goes to treatment,
Ardenwald is going directly into Johnson Creek. So every bit of that hard surface water is going straight into Johnson Creek.
Well, maybe it's for some parts of Ardenwald, but you've got Roswell Ponds, you've got the new pond. It's not all going to Johnson Creek.
Those of us who live pretty close to it, it's definitely going right down Johnson Creek. I can see it on a rainy day walking through my neighborhood.
Yeah, we do have electrification coming our way, which is not going to solve things overnight. So I hear your concern, but I tend to agree with the mayor on this, that the problem is that we have cars that use toxic chemicals and they leak on whatever surface they're on. So hopefully we have a future where we will have less leaky vehicles, or we get diapers for cars. I don't know what the solution is here, but I think there's problems no matter what the surface is underneath them. It's just a question of which problem it creates.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to move on from parking. We can come back to parking if we need to, but
weren't there 2 parking questions?
Well, the question was about being able to, well, it's not really a question. We're sort of telling you that we want to go down to the 1-for-1. But the idea of allowing the driveway basically to count for the required parking space. So that's the more significant change from our code, is the location of that required parking space.
Right.
Okay. All right. So we wanted to talk about ADUs and duplex standards and some of our recommendations here. So our current zoning code requires land use review for both duplexes and ADUs in the city. For duplexes, it's a type 2 review if they are located in certain areas. This one's kind of an easy fix, to be honest, because the House bill tells us that duplexes need to be permitted on all lots that allow a single unit home. So that's permitted by right. A duplex would go straight to building permit. There isn't a land use review piece to it. There are design standards and that kind of thing, and those would stay. But it's the land use review part that we need to remove from the code. But from ADUs, that's a little different. Right now, our code requires either a type 1 or a type 2 land use review for detached ADUs, depending on the size. Up to 600 square feet, 1 story is a type 1 land use review. Up to 800 square feet, up to 2 stories is a type 2 land use review. Attached ADUs, so an ADU in the basement or an addition to the house, is a type 1. So a land use review is required no matter what kind of an ADU you're building. And although ADUs are not expressly regulated by House Bill 2001, they're not part of the middle housing code. You might remember, I think it was a little over a year ago that we did our the ADU code amendments to that set of legislation that came out that removed the off-street parking requirement for ADUs and also removed the requirement for owner occupancy in ADUs. And our code had those, we took those out. But what we're recommending here, of course, duplexes by right, that's a requirement, but we would like to also recommend that ADUs be permitted by right as well and remove the land use review piece. We would still have, at least the way we are kind of envisioning this, there would still be an ADU section in the code that would have the design and the development standards, so the size, we still think that an ADU is intended to be sort of accessory, to the single family or to the single unit home. So we would maintain those sizes. We are kind of thinking about maybe allowing for some other tweaks within that code that would, one of the things that we've experienced within our department are folks that want to convert an existing accessory structure into an ADU. And when that existing accessory structure is larger than 800 square feet, for example, regardless of how big the ADU itself is going to be. So if you had a 1,000 square foot accessory garage that's been there for a couple of decades and you want part of it to be an ADU, our code right now would require you to go through a type 3 review, even if your ADU is only going to be 500 square feet of that structure, because our current code really cares about the size, the footprint of the structure that it's in, even if it's an existing structure. So we would like to take a stab at some language that allows for accessory structures that have been in place, more than, I don't know, 3 years or 5 years. The ADU itself would still need to meet the square footage, but we would give some wiggle room on someone being able to put an ADU into that accessory structure and then still have part of that, maybe that garage or that accessory garage to be storage for their garden supplies or something, like give some more flexibility on that. But to kind of require a type 3 variance, I think Mary Heberling just did a couple of months ago, a type 3 variance for 50 square feet for an ADU, because the structure itself was 850 square feet. So
see, I have disagreed with both of those standards from the time we established them. I was on the planning commission when we established them, and I was the minority voice, apparently. There are 800 square foot main houses out there. It makes no sense to me that we're arbitrarily saying that the ADU has to be smaller than the main house. We're about to have cottage clusters allowed almost everywhere. In that instance, all of the houses on that lot will be ballpark the same size, and they'll be smaller. So I think these arbitrary things where we're saying, you know, it has to be smaller than the house and it can only be X big, we really need to think about. Here's a question to ask yourselves. What's the difference between an ADU and a cottage? So if you have a half-acre lot and you want to put 3 ADUs in your backyard, is that not a cottage cluster now? And if that's a cottage cluster, what are the limitations on the size of your buildings? So we're going to get pretty tangled up at some point in sizes that are going to make us look pretty stupid if we don't sort through that whole comparative issue.
You know, I remember that debate well. And I think, I mean, the word accessory means accessory. It doesn't mean it's the dominant thing on the property. But B, I don't think this is going to be such a big issue after House Bill, after this code, because I suspect, the people who have the room to build big are going to build a duplex or a triplex or whatever. They're not going to build an ADU. So
Not
I
necessarily.
don't think this is going to be less of an issue going forward than it has been. But you also have to think about the layout and the orientation and stuff. So like a cottage cluster, conceptually are going to face an inner lot as opposed to facing out to the street. And, there's all those kind of details about orientation and, that play into whether you call something an ADU or a cottage cluster, yeah.
Well, and my understanding of cottage clusters has also been that we've considered those to be not required, but more likely to be more likely than ADUs to be opportunities for home ownership of some fashion. And an ADU is not going to be that. An ADU will be a rental. By very definition, it is not going to be purchased by someone else. So to me, that's the primary distinction we need to keep in mind when we're talking about these two different forms.
But visually and from the standpoint of the neighbor's backyard, yada, yada, what's the difference between an ADU and a cottage? And for that matter, let's continue that continuum and talk about tiny homes. Where do tiny homes fit in?
I guess I'm not totally tracking where this is going in relation to the question that Vera posed us.
Well, because when I start thinking about those things, I start asking questions like, so what she was talking about was that we have these limitations, that if you're using an already existing accessory structure, you can't even use all of the accessory structure as an ADU. You have to use a portion of that accessory structure if it's bigger than 850 square feet. But we would allow a cottage, maybe a cottage cluster of 4 cottages with a main house still remaining on a property, and those cottages could be bigger than 850 square feet. So why this artificial number that causes people to do strange things like take a 900 square foot building and make 850 square feet of it their ADU and 50 square feet storage or some, that's the kind of bureaucratic nonsense that makes people crazy. I think we need to think about actual reality on the ground, the difference between a cottage, an ADU, and a tiny home. And you're right, there's a difference between rental and ownership, but there we could very easily see a whole cottage cluster out there that's all rentals.
Yeah.
Some guy builds them and he's just going to rent them.
Mm-hmm.
So that even isn't a distinction, other than I don't suppose there'd probably be an opportunity for an ADU to become an ownership, but you could condoize it too. this is all getting very gray and very interconnected. And I think we need to think about what it is we're after. And to my mind, what we're after is to make it as easy as possible for somebody to build housing that's less expensive than another 2,300 square foot, blah, 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 $600,000 house. That's the goal. So if that is the goal, then maybe we could start thinking about getting rid of some of the arbitrary little things that feel like jumping through hoops, that feel like limitations that make no sense, particularly when you compare them to something that could be right next door. That's very, that allows them to do those things just because that's a cottage cluster and this is an ADU.
But isn't the proposal to do away with the type 1 and type 2 review requirement? So is that not a thing?
No,
I'm just trying to figure out how we got from there to where you're at. That's all I'm trying to do here.
Mayor, are you talking about also considering some of the other, the size limits that we're putting on? Okay, so not directly answering the question, but something to be putting in the back of our heads when we come to actual code creation around these questions is we also want to maybe reconsider some of the arbitrary size limitations or definitions. And I'll tell you there was a lot of robust conversation at the rulemaking process around what even is a duplex. And there were folks who were like, does it have to be attached? Can it be detached? Is that a duplex? And, and so that really gets into the same exact question. It's like, what are we really talking about here? Why are we making there's sort of arbitrary distinctions between really what is how, basically just legislating how many people can live in a home on a property. What's the purpose?
Right.
And
so, and I think that whole train of thought, you start looking at parsing these little concepts, and you have to have the big picture in mind. Otherwise, you're making decisions in a silo and saying, okay, for this category of little houses, this is the rule. But for this category of little houses, which is going to look identical to somebody walking down the street, we have a whole different set of rules. That's the point I'm trying to make here, is that let's step back a little bit, look at what we're after, look at what we're allowing, and then start thinking about, okay, do we need different rules for all these little categories? Because really they're arbitrary categories and they're, for all intents and purposes, just in our mind.
If I could jump in, this is great. And this is something that we on sort of back of house conversations have been having a lot of trying to figure this out. This is great. And I think these are the kinds of things, like I said, that we've been sort of struggling with as well. Part of what was in your staff report, and it's a couple of slides later, is the idea of kind of eliminating all this terminology and just talk about how many units are on a property. Cottage cluster is a little bit different because we're required to call it a cottage cluster, and there are certain things that go with that. So it sort of sits out by itself. But the challenge that we have when it comes to that is that this idea of streamlining and just talking about the number of units on a property. I've been saying that I don't want to make things more complicated by making it simpler, because it kind of is if all of the parties that need to be involved in something aren't similarly doing that. For example, the SDC calculations are by housing type, right? So there's an ADU SDC, there's a duplex SDC that is the same, but then there's the multifamily, which is 3 or more. So this terminology that we're stuck in, and I agree, is still also being used though by other agencies that affect how we do what we're doing. So there's a slide that I have that chart where we had all the simplification. I've got a big red line through it, because until everybody is catching up and wants to do it this way as well, we may be adding layers of uncertainty, because we're trying to figure out, what something is. Which SDC do we apply to it? if all we're requiring is how many units are on a lot. So in some ways, we're kind of stuck a little bit with the terminology to a point. But I think there's a way though that we can start thinking about what does it look like on the site, because we're going from our existing code right now that does allow a duplex and defines it a certain way. And a single unit home with an ADU, and that's generally what this is supposed to look like. But we're opening this up now to be a lot of other things. We have specific development standards assigned to an ADU. Right now, our code has different setbacks depending on how big the thing is, and that's also tied to the review type. So we were thinking about, well, if it's a smaller ADU, it can be closer to the property line. Maybe it does 5-foot setbacks if it's a type 1, or the smaller one. If it's a larger one, now it's meeting that. So we've sort of have all these cross things that we're trying to balance here. And what's also coming up and was also part of this conversation is we are recommending to allow for detached middle housing. It's not just attached. So you're right, walking down the sidewalk, I'm not sure you could tell that it's a house in an ADU or a detached duplex, or it could be any number of things. I think what we need to be careful of and just make sure that we're catching all of the things that need to be caught from what other agencies are doing and so on. But I think we can do it. We just need to make sure we haven't missed something and that we add a problem without having realized it.
I agree, and I do think we need to keep working with the other agencies to simplify the SDCs. Where I believe we're headed is size. Purely, it's based on size. It doesn't matter whether you're calling it an ADU, a cottage, or a castle. It's the size of the building. Therefore, that's your impact fee. And I think it's going to make sense to the county and places like that eventually to do that, because there's going to be all these new housing types. And I think we should and could start that conversation now. I wanted to, since you talked about setbacks, again, during the ADU thing years ago, I made the argument that it doesn't make sense to have a larger setback for an ADU, because if you just made an addition to the house that's stuck back to the exact same place you're putting the ADU, and it was 2 stories, and by definition of the fact that it is attached to the house, it's even bigger, you could build right up to the side yard, whatever that is, 5 feet, 7 feet, whatever that is. So to all of a sudden arbitrarily say, oh, but it's a different family, so now it has to be pushed 20 feet away from the side yard. That makes no sense to me.
Yeah, right. The way the code is written right now, a small ADU actually needs to meet the base zone standards because there isn't the public, process. The type 2 can be up to 5 feet or as little as 5 feet from the property lines, but it's a type 2 review process. We were going to kind of swap that, get rid of the land use review, and smaller ADUs can be closer. Larger ADUs just need to meet the base zone standard, just like the main home. But I think, but this kind of conversation it's interesting to hear. And so again, this is sort of our first foray into kind of having these conversations with the first group, to sort of get a sense of where folks are in kind of what are we calling everything, and what do the development standards need to be. In general, though, may I ask, if we are kind of moving forward with, we're still going to have ADU things like we're still going to call it that, and there's still going to be, design and development standards for detached ADUs. Attached that's a whole different thing, I think, but for detached ADUs, it sounds like the council is supportive of getting rid of the land use review part of it. But what are we thinking, or how are you thinking about the size? I mean, right now it's 600 and 800 square feet, or the maximum is 800 square feet, 75% of the size of the main structure. That's the math that we have to kind of keep it accessory to the single unit home that's on the property, right? It's supposed to be smaller. Is that the right number? Are you thinking that it needs to be
Bye, Laura.
more than 800, more than 75% from that standpoint? I'm not talking about a conversion of an existing accessory structure, if we can set that aside for a second, but if you're building a new detached ADU, is that the right proportion for an accessory, 75% or the 800 square feet? Is that
I
feel
don't,
too fake or
I
too
think if there's
made up?
there's a 600 square foot house on the property and you want to add another house on the property, who cares?
Got it.
It's why does it have to be smaller? So let's stop calling them accessory dwelling units and start calling them additional dwelling units. We can still call them ADUs that way, but it doesn't make any sense to just arbitrarily say it has to be smaller than the other one. Are we going to do that with cottage clusters? Are we going to say some have to be bigger and some have to be smaller?
Can I ask you a question though? Because right now, my brain goes to the cost associated with the development of this. And there are some, like whether the county isn't there yet. I mean, yes, they're, for West SDCs, for example, that's probably going to go with the square footage of the unit, and be tiered, that way. I was hoping they'd get to a smaller unit as the smallest, but they didn't. So I think that, and then of course there are other SDCs too that I'm not thinking about right now, but they're probably also tied to what you call it. If you're talking about building an additional dwelling unit and not calling it an ADU, you might be running into pretty high SDC charges because some other taxing district would consider that like what we were calling single family home. And so they would actually you'd be in a position where you were maybe not getting what you were hoping for, like you might end up with someone faced with some pretty big SDCs for development. I see where you're going, and I definitely see plenty of opportunities here, in my neighborhood where we've got, sort of pre-war housing that was built. And by the way, like with 2-foot setbacks, which is part of the way that it was made more affordable to get more homes built. But with longer lots, some houses here that are very, very small, cottages that potentially that's an opportunity for, one of our elders to be able to live in place and to stay in that home and to be able to build an accessory dwelling unit for, potentially, kids or grandkids to come and live on the property too. So, I am really with you on that flexibility. I want it too. I just want to make sure that whatever we do, we're not accidentally creating a situation where we have people who think they can build something affordably and then find out that they're going to be faced with a ton of big fees because of naming conventions or whatever. Or right. So then, sorry, then my thought also was, can the primary home become the ADU in that scenario?
Well, they've already paid their SDC, so it doesn't save you anything. But
well, I just mean in terms of calculation, I mean, to calculate that SDC, to figure out how much is it going to cost in building permits and everything else to build that other structure, I don't know. Is that possible? Can you say like my home that I live in is going to become the ADU for this larger home?
To me, that makes sense. And I was trying to remember. So Kelly or Ann, if you remember better than I do, we control 3 of the SDCs. Then there's Wes, that's 1, and then there's Parks. As far as I know, that's it, isn't it? Is there a school?
It sounds right.
I don't think there's a school or fire district SDC.
I don't think
There's
so.
not.
So that's it. So if we keep working with the county and we get the Parks to look at Wes's system, I think we can get there before too much havoc is caused. So I would rather that we go down the line of leading on what this should look like and try and help Clackamas County come along.
So Wes is going purely on square footage and not the terminology ADU.
That's the recommendation. And that's only for, I think, detached units. I think that they will still have a separate I believe there still will be a multifamily
Correct.
that's different. So it's really only about, and they haven't adopted it yet, by the way. That's still the recommendation to the BCC, and the BCC, I think, has to approve that.
I mean, it does seem to me like we're kind of, creating a tempest in a teapot over what, I mean, if we're not going to require duplexes to be attached, it's a duplex. Whether we call it ADU or duplex, I mean,
It all gets very gray real fast.
yeah.
So then what I might suggest is I'll do a little more. I would like to just get a little more information on the Wes business and kind of where they are in that process to see. And again, maybe the extended adoption process gives us some time to hope maybe, account for that. And maybe we can kind of, keep ADUs for now, but maybe that whole piece sort of goes away and everything is, if it's a detached duplex, it's not an ADU anymore. It's a detached duplex or whatever, and that's kind of what it is. The other weird thing, given that the state, kind of added this, you can't require off-street parking for an ADU, but I can for a duplex, because that's what so it's a minor point. And I'm sure it made sense at the time, I know, but now the middle housing piece is here too, that they start to overlap a little bit. So, but in the kind of matrix of the difference between all of these things, maybe there just isn't enough difference to want to hang on to this nomenclature or this terminology of this ADU, and it's just a detached duplex, and that's what it is. But we don't, again, I just want to make sure that we don't stick somebody with some kind of a financial thing if we don't have to. So.
Yes, Anne.
The only thing that I would add, and this would really go to Counselor Faulkner to course check. I believe it took them about 20 months to get through the process of setting for Wes, to get them to the point where they're presenting this. So it's not actually just Wes. We would have to talk into this. There were a lot of cities who came to the table. It was a relatively long process that Counselor Faulkner stepped in for. So it's just a cautionary note of, I'm not sure how willing they're going to be to make changes at this point with all the cities having bought in.
But that's also a point that it should be easier for NCPRD, since we're the only city in NCPRD.
Correct. And NCPRD is going to have to go back to the drawing board with the fact that Happy Valley is left. So there's definitely a process on that one. My comment was really only about Wes.
Yeah, well, we're not asking them to change because they're basing it on size, just exactly as we are. So it makes sense.
I would just add, I don't think that's imminent with NCPRD. They were in the middle of updating their SDC calculations. And actually they were considering that with Happy Valley exiting the district. They hit pause on that and stopped, and then went to the focusing on the district advisory board creation. And then I believe are planning to head into a master planning update. So I actually don't know when they're coming back to SDC. So I just wanted to let you know that may not be soon.
Well, and I think in terms of Milwaukee Bay Park, we didn't want it to be too soon. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Great. A little more homework there. Thank you. This is great. Okay. If we can move on from here, then just wanted to cover the next set of recommendations, which is the consolidated zones. It's not a multicolored map anymore. It's just two now, is the recommendation. This is not a House Bill 2001 requirement. It is something that came up in the comprehensive plan to try to simplify our residential zones. And based on the way the House Bill talks about housing type, is that, lot sizes are driven by the housing type, not necessarily the zone that they're in. This is what we've been workshopping with you folks before, with Planning Commission, with CPIC. This idea of kind of getting rid of some of the zones and sort of working this through with just the two zones. So this is what we're proposing as far as that zone consolidation works. So we're just calling them R1 and R2 for now. That's not, no one loves that. Those names, so we're sort of just calling it that for now, and maybe we can have a naming contest or something as part of the code adoption process, but we're just kind of using this now to just keep it a little bit simpler, but this is what we're thinking as far as the mapping changes for this. And of course then there would be corresponding comprehensive plan map changes for all of those different land use designations. But again, the R1 are what are our currently higher density zones. So that's what you see in the orange. And then all the purple is the R2 or our R5, R7, R10 zones all glued together in the consolidation. And then this relates to, there was a chart in your staff report that talks about the standards for these zones, and there are two options that are both in this chart. So, and I realized when I was putting this in here that this made sense to me because I've been looking at this chart for a long time, and so I just wanted to kind of go through it a little bit with you. So this is an example of the R2, sort of the lower density, the formerly lower density zone, I guess, and talking about how we would look at the development standards in each of these in these zones, and still driven by lot size, because that's what allows for the housing type. Couple of key ideas here that I wanted to go over. One was that there is a 1,500 square foot lot size. That's for townhouses. That's from the House bill itself. We call them row houses now, but it's townhouses. And we are suggesting that that also be the minimum lot size for a cottage in a cottage cluster if the cottage cluster were built in or were being developed in a way that would allow for fee simple ownership for the cottages. So not all cottages on one lot and either rental or a condominium type of thing, but if there was the opportunity to divide a cottage cluster and each cottage were on its own lot, then that would be a 1,500 square foot lot. And so the idea being that if a cottage is in the neighborhood of 900 to 1,000 square feet, then the lot itself would be, and the typical is about 150% of the size of the cottage. So that's where that 1,500, it also aligns with the townhouse size for the lot itself as well. And then as we were talking, as we've been thinking about the minimum lot size for, you know, a duplex goes wherever a single unit home goes, but the triplex on a 5,000 square foot lot, a quad on a 7,000 square foot lot, cottage cluster development on a 7,000 square foot lot, that's all laid out in the House bill. We hadn't talked about what the minimum lot size would be for a single unit home or for a single family home. That sort of just wasn't part of the conversation for a minute. And we thought about it, and well, you know, is it 5,000 square feet? Do we just kind of align it with the triplex? Like, what's the number? And we thought about how to increase the opportunity for single unit homes that are hopefully smaller, therefore hopefully less expensive. We looked at what some other communities have for their single homes as well for lot sizes, and what we're suggesting is a 3,000 square foot lot for a single unit home, which would also allow for a duplex, because you have to allow duplexes where single unit homes are as well. We currently have in our existing code a notation that does allow a single unit home on a lot as small as 3,000 square feet if it is a legal lot of record. So if it is an existing lot that is a lot of record from some old subdivision or some old something, that down to 3,000 square feet, you can put a single unit home on that. We don't have a lot of those, but there are some. So the circled part of the chart that I have here is aligning with that 3,000 square foot lot for a single unit home. So that's the option 2 part of the chart. The uncircled part is, you know, it's 5,000 square feet is the minimum lot size for a single unit home. And so the second column kind of lays out what would be permitted, you know, in any of those sort of groupings of lot sizes based on the House bill. And then the third column are the development standards that we thought, you know, we would suggest and kind of start testing out as far as the setbacks, the lot coverage. So we would be applying the R5 standards, you know, to the 5 to 7,000 or almost 7,000 and so on. The R7, you know, to 7,000 to 10, and then the R10. So we would be keeping the standards consistent with the lot sizes themselves. So the key question here, and I'm happy to obviously answer whatever questions folks have, but the key one here is this idea of creating a new minimum lot size for single unit homes, this 3,000 square feet. The rest is all matching the House bill for those lot sizes, but it's the single unit home and duplex that goes with it with the 3,000 square feet. It's sort of.
Before you dive into that, can I ask a clarifying question? What's the difference between the last two? Why is there a distinction between the 7,000 and the 10,000 or greater? I mean, I know there is R7, R10 in our current code, but going forward, aren't those the same? Isn't everything over 7,000 the same?
I'm not. Well, the difference are the development standards that would apply. So the R7 zoning district has 5 and 10 foot side yard setbacks, 20 foot front and rear, and 30% lot coverage. So it's really just that slightly smaller side yard setback that would apply to those lots. And then the R10 are 10 foot side and side yard setbacks. So
well,
I don't know if I'm answering your question, but.
Well, I guess that answers the question of why you kept the distinction, although, you know, you've shown us a map that shows us that our 10,000 square foot lots are not in places that were zoned R10.
Correct,
so now we would
right.
suddenly be making those lots in places where they had less of a setback required have more of a setback under this new code?
Based on the lot size. So that's kind of what, because the zoning districts, well, in a perfect world, right, would be the lot size. The R10 would be 10,000 square foot lots. The R7 would be 7,000. Certainly the existing zoning is kind of all over the place in there, and you have different size lots everywhere. But the idea was trying to match what would have been the, you know, the R7 standards with that size lot, the R10 standards with that size lot, just as a way of figuring out what those development standards would be and apply them to lots of a certain size, not the zone, but the lot itself. So you could have side-by-side lots that had different standards because of their size. That was the idea, that they are intended to reflect the size of the lot, not the zone that they're in, if that makes sense.
So I kind of concur with where Lisa's going here, that maybe we should consolidate those two and figure out what we think are good side yard setbacks and good front and rear setbacks, and
okay,
call it that for all those, because it, you know, as she pointed out, most of our 10,000 and bigger lots are not in R10. So you're going to end up with weird instances where, because they have a bigger lot that used to be an R3, now all of a sudden they have much bigger setbacks and their house is illegal.
Gotcha. Okay. No, that's certainly, that makes sense. So it's just a matter of figuring out, is the R7 the right set of standards, or is the R10 the right set of standards? So we can.
Or, I mean, are we going to have a conversation about those standards? I mean, I don't know if they're the right ones. I sitting here today, I don't necessarily agree with them. So I can't give that direction today. And I hope that we would be willing to have a conversation about these standards.
Yeah.
I agree. But I mean, I just don't see the distinction between a 7,000 square foot lot and a 10,000 square foot.
Oh, I definitely don't either. And I'm just, I agree with that completely. I just mean, you know, I don't.
What should the new standards be?
Yeah, I just don't know what that is without having a conversation about, and really digging into it and looking at some, historical examples of like what used to be and why did, how did we get to here today? Why do we have these different standards for different lots?
Okay, so before we get into that, then can I just ask, I just wanted to make sure I understood. So if you're up to 7,000 square feet, but not quite 7,000 square feet, that's one grouping. So these guys, sort of you're on the smaller side, are here. And that anything over 7,000 square feet is its own grouping of standards. So there's just basically the two standards. Do I have that right? Is that sort of the idea?
Yeah,
Okay.
Well, I mean, that's what motivated my question, but of course that begs that sort of skipped over your option twos, right? 'Cause
It
your
did.
option
Yeah.
twos,
Yeah.
change all of that.
Right. Which makes which is, I mean, that's a pretty dramatic, we recognize that, a pretty dramatic idea, allowing for much smaller lots for a single unit home. And then these distinctions maybe make more sense. I don't know. This is not to say that these are the right standards, to your point, Councillor Falconer, but sort of the idea of having standards that apply to the lot size, whatever those are, that they're, so this idea of a 3,000 to 5,000, 5,000 to 7 and up, that there are those three kind of groups of size lots. And that there are different sets of standards. So those three sets of standards for those.
so Vera, thinking about your 3,000 square foot lots, and we have to
Mhm.
think about it as a duplex because that would
Yep.
automatically be allowed.
Absolutely. Yep.
So let's say each unit in the duplex is 1,000 square feet, which is a comfortable sized living space.
Mhm.
And each unit is required to have off-street parking.
Mhm.
And then we are still, I assume, going to have some kind of standard around lot coverage.
Yep.
Can you even fit all that in a 3,000 square foot lot?
Well, those may, I mean, we can certainly come up with, try to sketch out some options for that. It's more about, I don't want to say this the right way, but we have to allow a duplex. Does a duplex get built on a 3,000 square foot lot? Maybe not every time. So it's, I mean, it's a very small lot, and once you insert the parking, that's really kind of where those tend to be the ones that are, the 2-story, they're the over under duplexes, right? Because you don't have that lot coverage, will minimize the bulk or the massing of that building. But the off-street parking is where maybe the limiting factor there. And it depends, can you get them, are those tandem spaces? There may be some creative alternatives to how that parking could work for that. But it's a good question. And I haven't sketched it out. It was frankly really more about the single detached dwelling, knowing that we'd have to allow a duplex certainly, but this came from this idea of allowing for a single unit home to be on a smaller lot. The duplex has to be allowed, yes, but we were more frankly thinking about kind of shrinking that minimum lot size for a single unit home to make some more options for those as well. But
So that was my first thought when I saw this was this will diminish the amount of middle housing built because that is what people will want to do. So we'll have less middle housing built and we'll just have smaller single unit homes. And we have a lot of, I suspect, 6,000 square foot lots, 6,000 to 7,000 square foot lots with all the R7 that was in town. That can, easily be divided. So we'll have two houses, and yes, they'll be somewhat less expensive than the, big houses over in Cherokee Farms, but they're probably not really going to be as affordable as a quadplex would be. So, I mean, to me, it kind of waters down the goal of more middle housing and more affordable housing. I think there are plenty of people it would be attractive to, but I think we have to keep that in mind. And I guess my other question is, what does it mean in terms of driveways? I mean, we've already how, our streets can be taken up by driveways because they're, how much parking are we going to lose because we're going to have more driveways? How much on-street parking are we going to lose? And how does that affect all those parking calculations? So, I mean, I can see, I can see reasons to do it and I can see reasons not to do it.
Yeah.
Well,
If it wasn't allowed outright, if it was a process so that the planning commission could look at to get, so you couldn't just automatically do a land division like Lisa is talking about from a 6,000 square foot lot to 3,000 square foot lots. You actually had to come in and have a good reason for doing that. In the instance where somebody's breaking up an acre lot into several houses, yeah, maybe there's a couple of them that are 3,000 square feet so that they can save some trees or whatever. But that was a process that allows human beings to look at it and say, yeah, that makes sense to do that. But I would be afraid of the same thing that Lisa's afraid of. If we make it just outright allowable to have 3,000 square foot.
Yeah, and in this conversation, this is something I keep struggling with around ADUs and in our conversations about affordability. I feel like we are continually under the surface asserting that if it's cheaper to build it, it will be cheaper to buy it. And I don't actually think that's true. I don't think there's any provision, and I don't know that there's any that we can create. Maybe there are, but I don't think there's any provision that guarantees a pass-through when you are selling or renting a property. If you've spent less money building it, you can still offer it for market rate.
Right, but the market rate for a 1,000 square foot house is less than a market rate for a 2,300 square foot house. So
Yes.
by definition, they will be cheaper. They may not be as cheap as we would like them to be, but they will be cheaper.
Yes, that is true. But oftentimes I feel like we're glossing over how much saving might necessarily occur in there, particularly in our conversations around SDCs and how we think about those and frontage fees and some of that stuff. So anyway, that's neither here nor there for this. It's I don't want to take us way off topic for where we are now. It just kind of, I couldn't help it.
I think it would be useful information to know sort of what the going, like say 1,000 square feet, if it's a single home, if it's a townhome, if it's a quadplex, what are the, I mean, and I know that's going to be hard to find because we don't have that much of it in the Portland metro area. And the recently built ones like over in Selwood are, very luxurious. So it may be hard data to really come up with useful data, but I think it'd be useful to know what's the relative price point for those things.
Right. And my concern is that I want to be honest with the public about what we're actually going to achieve here. It's not, I'm not poo-pooing and I'm not saying that it's not worthwhile to do everything we can to reduce the cost of building housing. I just want to be realistic about what the outcomes will be. So that's why I bring it up. And I agree with Councilor Beatty that it would be useful to have even just a couple examples of stuff. I understand it's not something we can do an exhaustive search and have good data on. But I just don't know. I don't know what's actually going to be more affordable as a housing type right now. If all things are equal and it's a 1,000-foot quadplex versus a duplex versus all of the things we've just discussed. I don't know. I'm making assumptions in that.
Well, I think that the assumptions are shared. I mean, those assumptions are shared, by the folks who were behind getting this law, HB 2001 passed, so Join and Hacienda and all the folks who build affordable housing were asking for these. They were also asking for, just to take us a little step back, because, you know, what Councilor Beatty was just saying about, you know, the option, what's going to happen if we're requiring on off street parking for, you know, one per unit. You know, if you're requiring one per unit, you know, someone might decide that it makes more sense to build two separate, you know, to do that split instead of doing duplexes. I don't know that adding, I have a couple of thoughts here. I don't think that adding a review process ever reduces costs or is necessary. I don't want to you know, if I would much rather us come up with standards that are just objective standards that folks can go into a building, you know, into the building permit office and say, I want to do this. I want to follow the rules, and they get to do it. I mean, I think that we need to be that needs to be sort of like what we're after all the time. I don't think that we get someone to, you know, come in and say, well, you could save some trees or have less pavement if you go with this, you know, as a, you know, or if you go in front of planning commission and have the opportunity to basically spend thousands of dollars on attorney's fees and come out with nothing. I'm a little bit concerned about that possibility, like that we're suggesting that more review process is going to lead to better outcomes. And then the other thought, we're just assuming that we're doing this 1-to-1 parking ratio, and I'm not really sure how we got here. This group has not had a conversation about this. We are allowed to so that we aren't putting in a ton of driveways. We're allowed to count on-street parking as part of the minimum parking. I mean, we could also require no parking at all, but I don't know if we're there. We're just really glossing over a very important cost factor on whether or not middle housing gets built. And I'm not sure if we're going to come back to it or if this council is going to have another opportunity to talk about it, but I don't feel like we have. And I don't want a ton of new driveways at all. And I want to be, you know, I want to make sure that, you know, we're also talking about, because I don't know exactly what all of the development standards are. So I'm not sure if I like the idea of applying the development standards for the smaller, you know, the 5,000 square, you know, the R5. I don't know what that means for height, for example. You know, what does that mean then for reducing, you know, the area, you know, reducing the size of the building in order to save trees? You know, does that mean that folks, I mean, I want to know, you know, what are we giving up there? Because I think that there's potentially a conversation to have about, you know, the over under duplex standard that, you know, if we're applying R5, then we're, you know, maybe we're giving that up as an opportunity to build middle housing, depending on, you know, other standards that we're not thinking about. We've been thinking a lot about setbacks. We haven't been, you know, there's all kinds of design standards that we haven't talked about.
I concur completely about parking. It's on my list of questions to bring up. I do think we could, you know, there's all kinds of ways we could approach it. We could say per lot, there's a minimum of 1 off-street parking, and then per unit of housing, maybe it's 0.5 or something like that, so that you've now, you know, if it's a quadplex, there's 2 parking spaces required. If it's a cottage cluster with 8 cottages, there's 4 parking spaces required. I absolutely think we could start to explore parking requirements. I think I've always thought they were too high by requirement.
I will point out that our parking consultant recommended that we go with the 1 space per unit, based on his study of, you know, 4 different neighborhoods and areas. And I will say my own personal view is it's going to be really hard if we don't go with the 1 space per unit. I think we have so different streets in this town, even just within a few blocks of each other. Like you go down 37th and it's a fairly wide street for a while and there's plenty of on-street parking, and then you get to a point where it's almost like an alley and there's no on-street parking. So I mean, and we have streets that allow on-street parking on one side only, like Harvey. you know, et cetera, et cetera. So it's going to be hard to, if we're going to go down the path of allowing on-street parking to count for the required parking, then I think there's a ton of caveats that have to go with that, and it's all location dependent.
If I could jump in on that particular point, that's been some of those kinds of questions have been some of the things that we were asking, both of CPIC, in the open house as well. This idea of having a menu of standards that were more location or kind of context sensitive. They were tied to pretty specific outcomes though. For example, the idea of allowing extra height in a building if it meant preserving a tree that was on the site, right? So that if having less footprint, more height meant that, you know, this type of tree could be preserved on the site, then that would be something that people were generally open to. We haven't figured out the specifics of what those would be yet. To your point, Councillor Faulkner, about the height, across all of our zones right now, the maximum height is 2.5 stories, 35 feet. That's kind of so that's been the height that we've been working with in even carrying forward into this middle housing. That's sort of that whole Jello mold thing that we keep talking about, the box, in trying to keep, you know, the box sort of that idea of allowing more units in the box, but the box is generally kind of what we understand it to be even now or on across different lots, so that things sort of feel the same even if there are more units within it. But as I said, the idea of allowing for height or allowing an on-street space to count for one of the required spaces, again, if it means that a tree could be preserved on the property, or because, you know, again, we're trying to blend some of this tree code stuff into these standards as well. And there did, at least from the findings from the open house there and from CPIC too, I think there was openness to look at allowing on-street spaces to count. I don't know that I can recall folks kind of like, yeah, we don't need to require any parking. I don't know that we're at zero, but it did seem that, you know, one on site, one on street, you know, could work. But to Councillor Beatty's point, not every street is the same, and what, you know, if it's a street that doesn't have the improvements there, that parking space actually isn't there yet because you're on one of those streets, I'm gonna call on, you know, Olson Street, you know that, Councillor Faulkner. I mean, it's not developed at all. There are no curbs, it's gravel on the sides, you know, that kind of thing. You know, one of the things to think about is, you know, our frontage improvement requirements that get triggered for additional dwelling units. So yeah, maybe that on-street space counts, but you have to build it if you happen to be building on a site that doesn't have those frontage improvements already there. So I think there's a way to get there, but in some cases it won't be free. You know, there may be additional work that needs to be done. So you may not have to build the space on site, but you may have to build it on the street, and that will require, you know, the sidewalk, curb, et cetera, and that stuff's expensive too. But anyway, it's, you know, there's more to think about kind of as we try to figure out how these frontage improvements happen and the parking. But it kind of just all that to say, you know, we have the parking study to kind of figure out where that could work, and also does that meet kind of what we think the occupancy or the demand is for parking right now, but also understanding that there are places where the parking isn't there right now. It would have to get constructed to allow for the on-street space. But there is openness generally, it seems, to have flexibility in the standards if something is gained from that. And it seems to be trees was one of the things that people were really happy to get.
Is there a way, do you think there's a way to write that into the code so it's just objective?
Yes,
you know,
it needs to be. It really needs to be clear and objective.
And then
clear and objective flexibility, I think, is what we're hoping for.
Right.
Yeah.
And I guess I would want to know if I, from the group here, if, you know, because preserving an existing tree would be great, obviously, in lots of cases. In some cases, it might not that, I mean, we might not really even want that. I mean, it could, you know, we're not going to, you know, save an invasive tree of heaven, for example. I mean,
Right. No,
you know,
it
so I
depends
guess
on
I
the
would
tree.
also want the
Yeah.
flexibility for it to be a, you know, preservation of a space for and or requirement to requirement to plant a tree. I don't want it to be so rigid that it's just a preservation of a tree, you know, the existing tree. It could be preservation of space for tree canopy generally.
Yeah, so long as it's not used as an excuse to cut down a tree we do want to keep. Vera, I just want to say that in these conversations, it is helpful for me to have diagrams. And I know that they're scattered throughout. You know, we've done a ton of diagramming around all of this. It was all over the place. So if in these conversations in the future, you can just pull some of those up, it's really helpful for me to have them in front of my eyes when we're having the conversation, because I just start losing my spatial awareness and all the numbers blur together. Thanks.
And I guess in talking about parking, it's also, I mean, there was something in the comments we got today from Renelle Coburn, kind of triggered a past conversation that we've had about, could there be examples of, you know, having parking, but having it be like nose in or angle parking for a multi-unit, you know, for a fourplex or whatever. So I don't know. I mean, that gets into some tough questions, I think, about streetscape. But I mean, I just want us to not lose sight of that, you know, potential too. I mean, the idea, especially like with the flag lots and with the, you know, things like, you know, does every unit have to have the parking be right adjacent to the unit, or is having this parking all be out at the street okay? You know, so
that's I my ears perked up on that concept too, and it kind of falls in line with something else. And this is even further down the road, but unfortunately, all of this stuff is intermingled. Is our TSP and concepts around a new standard, which we sort of established already, a new standard for neighborhood streets. If it's not a collector and it's not an arterial, maybe a neighborhood street in Milwaukee by design is a Wunert. And it does have, you know, it's curvilinear, so people aren't, you know, interested in going 50 miles an hour. And it's narrower, and the spaces that cause it to be curvilinear are parking on different sides of the street, and they are angled parking, which takes up a little more space. And then there's maybe, you know, tree planters, or there's stormwater swales, or there's whatever. But we start to make streets, the neighborhood streets, places where you would expect to see people, children, couples walking, old folks, people on bikes, rather, and if you're there in a car, you are a guest, and you are meant to behave that way, and you're meant to drive slowly until you get to a collector or an arterial. And I think, you know, that concept alone really shifts the cost of doing neighborhood streets that are walkable, instead of building 22 feet of pavement, curb, gutter, planter strip, and then 6 feet of sidewalk on either side. We're now doing, you know, whatever it is that the fire department would require. It's, you know, 15 feet of pavement, and it's curvilinear, and there are no sidewalks because people are expected to be able to safely walk in the street. And I think if we can develop that further, that really opens up the whole parking question, because a lot of our right-of-ways are big enough that you could pull that off. You could have angled parking on one side of the street, and then halfway down the block, it's angled parking on the other side of the street, which causes the street to, you know, make some S curves, make it so that you don't drive fast. It's hard to do this stuff in
stovepipe.
Yeah,
It is. It is.
Well, and I mean, I think that this is some of what, you know, as we've been talking about how staff work together on projects, it's all about how do we develop as a community our capacity for a slightly bigger picture at a given time. You know, if there's a way for us to say that, yes, you can do some angle parking on streets that are already arbitrarily, you know, they're already 15 feet wide. It's limited to 2 sets of angle parking per block or something, and they must be on opposite sides. I don't know, you know, it gets really prescriptive, but it seems like there's a way that we could do this and tell the story so that it's not coming across as every single street is going to be a big parking lot, because I think that's the concern that you might start hearing from the public is we really need to do a good job of explaining what we mean when we start talking about parking, because people get really worried. And I think there are some really valid concerns there for, you know, older folks or people who have mobility issues who get concerned about whether or not they're going to have access to the place they live, but they may not, you know, they may not qualify for a handicap parking permit. There's a story here about how we are as a community and how it relates to parking that we need to pay a lot of attention to, and listen and articulate thoughtfully, I think, in order to really illustrate that our intent is not to cram cars everywhere. Our intent is to still make this a livable landscape that has better spaces for people who are not in cars, not worse spaces for people who are not in cars.
We've started having conversations with Steve Adams from the engineering side. Also, just to, you know, let's talk about all these things in SDCs, but let's talk about the street design in these cross sections and what did these mean? Our, you know, consultant brought up with him as well the you know, the 19th Avenue Greenway, the Island Station sort of Greenway design, and is that something that can be applied in other neighborhoods? Steve also did bring up you know, there is a cross section for what they call the low volume neighborhood street. So it is narrower and it's not sidewalks on both sides and all those things. So there is not ultimate flexibility in the code, but there is some built in that the city engineer has some flexibility in what the ultimate cross section, you know, is. Certain streets, of course, need to be what they are, but the neighborhood streets, there is some wiggle room there on what happens. I think it's also a matter of figuring out how do we apply that, this kind of creative application of on-street parking or on-site parking when this is kind of infill development. It happens in, you know, maybe one lot on a street at any given time. Kind of how do we work that within a network that we've sort of laid out? We kind of think about what it might be, you know, at the end, but it gets there over a period of time. And so making sure that it makes sense as it's being developed too, in parts. So so we're already having conversations with him. So this is great to kind of, to the extent that we can, kind of bring some of their stuff into this without doing the TSP right now while we're doing this at the same time. Yeah, everything's related to everything. That's part of the, you know, so what's the right way of packaging this up to get as far as we can on this while bringing other stuff in to match it. Yeah, something's going to be ahead. We're going to be ahead in this, and other things are going to be caught up, but hopefully we can set the stage there.
I think raises a really good point. That's, you know, something that I always have to sort of remind myself, which is, even though we're talking housing first and we're talking about potentially having a conversation about reducing parking spaces, I'm not planning on bulldozing my house today, and neither are the vast majority of Milwaukeeans living here. We're not going to suddenly see every single lot develop as a result of these code changes. And so the idea that suddenly one street is going to be bombarded by a ton of new on-street parking because of this, a potential code change here in some places, I don't think that that's the reality. And I think, you know, that it also it gives us that space to be able to talk about the TSP and how these types of design standards will probably, you know, how we would like to see them play out. And I think that, you know, in terms of, you know, building out that parking space in order to accommodate that on-street parking, you know, we've got the fee in lieu of here. I would expect that we would take advantage of that. A lot of people would take advantage of that program, and that we would maybe have a conversation about deploying that, you know, maybe more localized. I don't think we necessarily, you know, I don't know what the exact restrictions are on where that money needs to be spent. If it's raised in this neighborhood, does it have to be spent in this one? And can we, you know, maybe there's a room for a conversation about, you know, are we actually even breaking that even further for, like, you know, infill development on 29th? If we do prepare a VUNORF, you know, like sort of standard for a greenway on 29th, you know, is it sort of like a FELOC for a local improvement district, you know, that's only going to be applied there, and then that thing gets built out when there's enough money to do it, or enough people have signed up.
And I just want to, because this came up in one of the comments we received, I think it was over a year ago that Layla Aman, our community development director, gave us a very long and detailed presentation on how it is that commercial development and more multi-use family housing development happens in some places than it does in others. And in that presentation, I'm sorry, I don't have the date in mind, but she pretty much spelled out the answer to the question of what's going to prevent what's happening in Sellwood from happening here. And the distinction is that we are not Sellwood. We do not have the density of amenities and the walkability, and all of the things that make Sellwood are not present in Milwaukee. So this is not something that that is going to happen here. And it's not just because it's only a mile away. There's a whole host of other factors that we had a great discussion around and presentation on in a work session a while ago, over a year ago.
Well, I will say I'm not at all convinced that's true. I think we don't have the amount of amenities and restaurants that Sellwood have, but we also have lower taxes, lower SDCs, lower building permit costs, all of that. So I think this could roll out pretty fast, and especially in, you know, areas close to downtown, areas close to light rail. I think this could roll out pretty fast.
So I will say, yes, that there are places where we actually do want higher density, and that's a different zone. But to your other point, I sent an article around to all of you a while ago from Sightline Institute. That was an article about how this type of zoning has existed out in, if any of you remember, an outer south, not outer, but around 82nd Avenue, Southeast Portland neighborhood for a long time. Vera, do you remember which one? I know so many people who live there. I'm blanking on the name. Anyway.
Is it Montevilla? I don't
yes,
know.
it is.
Oh, there. Yeah, it's right over there.
So they had this sort of zoning in place for years, decades, and they have not seen the explosion. You see here and there, yes, you'll see a more densely developed lot, but it has not rolled out rapidly in any way, shape, or form. And Montevilla has more amenities than most of Milwaukee, including downtown. So I think we have good reason to feel pretty comfortable that it's not going to be a rapid scale change. Closer to light rail and on our mass transit lines, yeah, it could happen faster.
Well, and can we just back up? I mean, we're not even talking about high density development anyway in any of these areas. So I really think that we're conflating two things that aren't related at all. The high density, like what people are complaining about, you know, on 17th Ave, that's zoned completely different than what we're talking about. That's the commercial, that's the high density commercial areas, that's the downtown district. We are talking about infill development of at scale housing.
But a lot of it in Selwood is not at scale. I mean,
But we're talking about we're not talking about fourplexes.
no, I am talking about fourplexes. I'm talking about the houses right behind New Seasons. The things that have gone in, the whole block that's been wiped out behind New Seasons, except for like one small house on either end and big fourplexes and duplexes in between.
Okay, and I would also, I would just say that if you drive around town and you look at some of the oldest homes in Milwaukee, they are much bigger than those homes. And so let's also, yes, they are. The farmhouses that are 3 stories in my neighborhood are, yes, they are. Yes, they are.
No way they're more square footage.
Come walk in my neighborhood and I will show you. I will
Oh,
show you the giant farmhouses in my neighborhood that are so completely much bigger than anything that we're talking about here.
Mhm.
So Vera,
Okay.
bring us back.
No, this is
Good thing. It's a good thing this is
Great.
virtual, isn't it? Those two would be in fisticuffs.
pretty sure we're being recorded though. Couple of other questions I wanted to bring up was the idea of, well, I'm just going to bring it up but it's still sort of an open question, this idea of ADUs with middle housing, but we sort of kind of talked about that a lot already, that are we even still talking about ADUs? So I kind of want to just sort of put that to the side until we kind of figure out that idea, because now it's really more about the number of units on a lot. And that's probably still kind of the way that we'll be thinking about that. So if it's okay, I don't know that we need to spend too much time on that. And then the only other I wanted to sort of close the loop on the flag lot discussion a little bit. I know we talked about it in pretty great detail the last time I was here, but there were some questions that came up about sort of pros and cons, of the idea of allowing the rear lots access via an easement. I have a couple of images from Cherokee Farms because those are the only ones that we have that here in the city anyway, courtesy of the county. But again, here on the left, sort of the traditional flag lot, which has the flag pole that's part of the property, and then these rear lots that are at Cherokee Farm. They're all houses here now, but anyway, but these lots in the back are accessed via an easement across the front lot. And so the question is, is this something that we want to think about? The bigger question is the idea of reducing some of the standards for creation of flag lots. Another way of doing that is to not require the flagpole at all and just have it be a rear lot. And I think one of the questions that came up was sort of some of the pros and cons to this. So we did reach out to some communities to see what they had. For example, some communities allow both. City of Canby allows both, and there are pros and cons to both. But in general, some of the, I'll call them sort of the negatives, I guess, of the rear lot idea generally has more to do with the property owners themselves and sort of when properties turn over and their ability to work together as far as the easement goes and maintenance of the driveway and that sort of thing. It does provide more flexibility from a land division standpoint because in the case of Cherokee Farms, it's a little different because these were all new lots. But the idea of developing some of these deeper lots that are existing, that have an existing house, allowing for a rear lot like this and not requiring the pole can help the parent lot and the parent house remain in place. It eliminates that problem of the minimum width of the pole, the setback from the parent house to the pole because you're creating a new property line. So it in many ways can make the land division simpler from a land division standpoint because you're not affecting the parent lot from that standpoint. You're not creating a new property line. So there is more flexibility certainly on, on that standpoint, but the cons or the negatives that we heard from some of the planners were, had more to do with the people that live on the lots and being able to work together as far as that goes. I did have, I think is the next slide, I had some quite, so this is one of those those rear lots at Cheragino Farms. This is the front house, and you can just sort of see in the back, the rear lot house. This driveway is the easement it's basically a T. So this easement goes back, and there are two side-by-side houses. This is that house in the back. And this is the front yard of that house. So it's mostly driveway turnaround space. And this is the front house. So at least there, these are 20-foot front and rear yard setbacks. So this is sort of the relationship that happens at Cheragino Farms. Anyway, this is all new construction. Folks kind of know what they're getting in this case, but just kind of wanted to show what that is. But sort of the ultimate question here around flag lots is this idea of relaxing the flag lot standards, and do we want to do that at all? And then if we do, are there certain situations where we think that might be a good idea? And one of those suggestions from the last discussion was the idea of relaxing those standards for middle housing development specifically. And what kinds of things? Is it the pole width? Do we want to allow for even these rear lots? Kind of what is the universe of relaxation of these standards that that council thinks you might want to think about, or you generally want us to look more into, or generally supportive of, or that kind of thing. The Planning Commission talked about this at their last meeting, and in general, they were supportive of relaxing, these standards. One of the commissioners did call sort of the flag lots, or this kind of idea, as a massive opportunity for infill, but they were generally more in the camp of, if we are going to do this, that it should be for middle housing, that kind of should be the caveat for that. So that's, I just wanted to come back with kind of some of the pros and cons that we had discovered from some of the other planners and folks. And I was out at Cheragino Farms anyway, because I'm down there inspecting the houses constantly, so because they keep going up so fast. So I happen to have to look at one of these back lots, and I wanted to take a look at it and take some pictures. So so this was kind of the sort of the final issue that I wanted to chat about tonight. And it looks like we still have a few minutes left. Yeah.
Can I ask just a clarifying question? The width of the driveway here, I guess I'd like to know. And the fact that it's the easement, I mean, the con that we were given about getting along and who maintains it, I mean, when the front house is fenced yard like this, it seems like that is going to be less of an issue. Is that really something to worry about? So I guess the width of it, it seems pretty clear who's, it seems pretty clear the front lot can't interfere with their access.
Right.
As far as who has to repave it in 30 years, I guess maybe that's the kind of thing they fight over. And did the people in Canby, or the places that allow both, tell you which one was opted for most often?
I don't have an answer to that last question. That's a good one. And we can follow up to find out which seems to be the preferred approach. The width of the easement itself is 20 feet at Cheragino. The paved width, I believe, is I want to say it's 12 or 14. I can go back to the plans and double check that, but the easement itself is 20 feet wide, and all the utilities are in that easement. It's not just the driveway itself, but that's where all the easements, or all the utilities are. And I think you're right, from a maintenance standpoint for now, this is brand new, kind of everybody knows what's happening. I think it's more the sort of the overtime probably kind of, and because all of this was newly constructed, the easement language is brand new. Everybody knows what it is. Everyone gets it. I think it's sort of over time, or when you have an existing house and they do something else, maybe that's kind of where it can get a little squirrely when you've got an existing and a new, but here anyway, it's all new. So it's all pretty dialed in, I think. But it's a good question on Canby, sort of what is the preferred approach. So that's something I can follow up with them about.
So I agree with the planning commission, easier for middle housing. And as far as how easier, whatever reduces the amount of pavement.
Yeah, when I'm looking at these, I think, could we could we mandate just using like the little paved strips or something, or it would really, I think, improve the aesthetics in the neighborhood all around. And I concur that it should be bent toward incentivizing middle housing. That's really what we want to get out of this, I think.
There's probably a fire code issue in terms of width and nature of pavement, I would guess, but.
I mean, you see driveways that have it, but it's true that those are not, really long setbacks. So it would be worth asking if there are or not, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm trying to remember what the fire department's distance is before they have to be able to get a truck closer. Was it 100 feet, 60 feet?
I know they want 20 feet clear. I'm trying to remember what their sort of distance from hydrant to, the farthest corner of the structure. I can ask CFD, their development review, their fire development review person about all that stuff. Yeah. So.
I mean, I'd like to know, I had asked Vera earlier if any of the NDAs, and I guess it's really mostly Ardenwald, had notice of this discussion, and it sounds like they didn't. So I'd like to hear from the people who live in these lots and the people who live around these lots. And but I'm not averse to the idea of using it to incentivize middle housing.
Great. Okay. All right. Then I just wanted to let you know what sort of the next steps are that I'm conscious of the time because I think I have until 7:30, so I'm a minute over. But we have an analysis of the open house results. So that's actually going to be in the CPIC packet that will go out on Thursday. So we'll have that ready to go, and so we can certainly send links to everyone about what came out of that. We're continuing to refine the code concepts. We're on to a next set of code things to get going. There will be a recommendations report. We're working on the draft code itself that will be prepared for the DLCD grant. We have our CPIC meeting next week on the 20th. And then we're coming back to you on June 15th with our adoption timeline review preview, sort of how we're mapping out what's going to be happening after June, basically, and what our process will be for that. And that will include NDA meetings, so sort of community engagement and work sessions and, all of the things as we work through the actual code language, because we're getting direction, from you, from Planning Commission, from CPIC, certainly, and from the community. And now we need to put that into real words that looks like code, and start tweaking all of that as we move forward. So thanks. This was great. I kind of want to have a study session all the time because I like having this much time. This is awesome. Thank you.
That was good. I utterly agree with you. And I want to throw something out because I don't know if we'll see it first or we'll see it last. But when you do get to the higher density zone, whatever we're going to call that, are we talking about SROs anywhere in our code?
Not yet, but maybe we are now. So yeah, okay.
And I would like us to maybe, before we jump on that as a potential housing solution, there's some leaders, in the area of affordable housing, and I'm thinking specifically about Dr. Zapata, who is not quite such a fan of SROs, and I would like to learn a little bit more from her and Dr. Bates, who were the only people I think who actually submitted some testimony to the Portland City Council against calling SROs housing. And so I think we need to do a little bit more work before we start down this path and understanding sort of the differences between, what are we calling housing? What are we calling transitional? What are we calling shelter? Because I feel like I don't know enough yet to be on board with zoning in a bunch of areas for SROs when they could potentially, not be a great housing solution.
Well, so when somebody rents a house that has 5 bedrooms and then they get 5 roommates, that's just an informal version of an SRO. I
agree. I'm not saying that you're wrong and I'm right, because I don't know that I have a position. All I'm saying is that there are leaders in this community who have very serious concerns about SROs, and I want to learn more before we start down this road.
And I would like to hear what their concerns are.
That's all for me. Thank you very much for your time. This is great.
Thank you, Vera.
Thank you, Vera.
This was good,
Mayor?
Vera.
Thank you, Vera.
We don't have anything on the agenda, but there was a desire to talk about the Sunrise Corridor letter. So if you all wanted to chat about that for a few minutes, that'd be great.
Yeah, and I kick us off real quick. This was a request that came from C4 last week. And there's just a proposal to get some money to work on the Sunrise Corridor. This is a road that the mayor worked very hard on getting the proposal that went into the sadly failed T2020 package to look like something that had values that respected climate and looked at multimodal transportation and workforce housing and all of these things. And lo and behold, the proposal that they are putting forward for the Sunrise Gateway Corridor includes a lot of those things. And I don't know if you had a chance to look at the Sunrise fact sheet that went around or not, but when I look at this, I see a proposal that I'm happy to support by adding our local to it. And I feel like they've done some decent work here, and lending our support also gives us a seat at the table to ask them to please continue to prioritize those things. They need a logo by tomorrow, so that's why we're here. And not during a regular session next week.
And I agree with Kathy. I think, they have, what they're describing or the points that they're going to be considering in this moment are very different than what they were talking about even 2 years ago. 2 years ago, it was going to be a brand new 4-lane highway that was 1,000 feet away from another 4-lane highway, neither of which had bike lanes or anything else on them, sidewalks. And now they're trying to take all of that into consideration. Whether they'll do what I got them to, which was that the 2 of the lanes in that new 4-lane thing were dedicated bus only lanes. That will be, we'll see if they get there. But I think we have more opportunity maybe to steer it if we're joining them in the ask for money than we will if we're throwing rocks.
And they've outlined that they want to do an anti-displacement strategy. They've done almost 2 years of engagement in the community and around the area. So I see efforts here that I would like to encourage Clackamas County and engaging in elsewhere. So I feel good about supporting it.
I hadn't seen it before the meeting, so I'm trying to look at it now. But is it it's both in unincorporated and Happy Valley?
I think all of it falls outside of Happy Valley, but it's within Happy Valley's UGMA.
Oh.
Yeah. There's a map on page 2 of that visioning concept PDF.
Yeah, so what the encircled area is roads, or the encircled area is just a marker of the area?
That's the area that's adjacent to the road.
Okay, so the road is the south edge.
I don't have the thing in front of me. And I don't remember.
I think the road runs, what's the north edge?
So there's the existing 224, and then north of 224 by varying distances would be the new roadway. That would be the Sunrise Corridor. So you know that the cutoff right now that's out there, that
Yeah,
sits
yeah,
you-
yeah.
okay, that would basically extend. That would continue.
Okay, well, that's why I think it has to be the south edge. But anyway, okay. Okay, well, I mean, you guys have been in the conversations. If you're comfortable with it, I have no objections. Would be nice to get a little more notice on these things.
Yep, we agree.
Yeah, there wasn't much time.
Yeah.
It's, you know, it's this crazy period we're going through where every government official has a big pot of money to spend, but they want to know tomorrow what you want to spend it on.
So who are they pitching this to?
The feds.
The feds, okay.
Mhm.
So that is a majority of council. We're not voting because you can't study session, but I just want to make sure, does anyone have any opposition? So that the logo would mean that generally we're all supportive. Councilor Nicodemus, any concerns? You're good? Okay. And Councilor, I'm sorry, what, Mayor?
We got head nods all around.
Perfect. Okay, then I will let Trent know that we will have him the logo. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ann.
All right, everybody, good work. Thank you. And I will see you soon. We are adjourned.
Thanks all.